The altimeter was screaming at him. 50 feet, 45, 40. Flight Lieutenant Michael Esmonde kept the nose of his B-24 Liberator pointed straight down at the grey water of the Bay of Biscay, his co-pilot calling out numbers that would have made any sane pilot pull up immediately. 35 feet, 30. The ocean was rushing up to meet them with terrifying speed, whitecaps clearly visible now, individual waves distinguishable. 25 feet. 20 feet, skipper. The co-pilot's voice was tight. Esmonde levelled off. The bomber shuddered as it transitioned from dive to level flight, so low that spray from the wave tops spattered against the nose. Ahead, barely 400 yards away, the conning tower of U-603 was just disappearing beneath the surface, the submarine's crew having spotted them too late. The Germans were diving, but they were going to be too slow. Depth charges away. 4 Mark 9 charges tumbled from the Liberator's bomb bay, each packed with 200 pounds of Torpex explosive, each fused to detonate at precisely 25 feet of depth. Esmonde pulled back hard on the yoke, the bomber clawing for altitude as the ocean behind them erupted in 4 massive columns of water. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. When the spray cleared, U-603 was gone. Oil bubbled to the surface, followed by debris, pieces of wooden decking, a life jacket, the distinctive circular remains of a pressure gauge. Esmonde circled once, his crew photographing the kill, then radioed the position back to base. 1 U-boat destroyed. Time elapsed from visual contact to confirmed kill. 90 seconds. It was 7:15 in the morning on July 2nd, 1943. Before breakfast was over, Allied aircraft operating over the Bay of Biscay would sink 2 more U-boats using identical tactics. 3 submarines destroyed before the sun was fully up. 3 of Germany's most sophisticated weapons reduced to spreading oil slicks by aircraft flying so low they could practically touch the waves. This was the result of a revolution in anti-submarine warfare that had occurred in the spring of 1943, a tactical shift so dramatic that it transformed the Battle of the Atlantic almost overnight. The change wasn't in the aircraft themselves, or even in the weapons they carried. The revolution was in how low they were willing to fly. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand what came before. In 1942, when Allied aircraft hunted U-boats in the Atlantic, they did so from altitudes measured in hundreds of feet, sometimes thousands. The reasoning seemed sound. Higher altitude gave you better visibility of the ocean surface, let you spot submarines from farther away, gave you time to maneuver for an attack run. But that reasoning contained a fatal flaw. A U-boat on the surface in 1942 could dive completely disappear beneath the waves in about 60 seconds. Less. If the crew was experienced and moved fast, an aircraft at high altitude, even one that had already spotted its target, needed time to set up an attack run, to line up properly, to release weapons at the right moment. By the time depth charges hit the water, the submarine was often already deep enough that the charges exploded harmlessly above it. The U-boat's pressure hull was strong enough to withstand tremendous force, but only if that force wasn't close enough. A depth charge needed to detonate within about 15 feet of the hull to rupture it, within 30 feet to cause serious damage. The statistics from 1942 were grim. British RAF Coastal Command flew roughly 7,000 hours of anti-submarine patrols in the Bay of Biscay during the first half of that year. They lost aircraft at a rate of about 16 planes for every single U-boat actually sunk. 16 aircraft, 16 crews, 10 men per crew, 160 lives for 1 submarine. That ratio was unsustainable, and everyone knew it. The Germans were building U-boats faster than the Allies could sink them. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the U-boat arm, had nearly 400 submarines operational by the spring of 1943, and his crews were sinking Allied merchant ships at a rate that threatened to strangle Britain's supply lines entirely. Something had to change. That something turned out to be a device called the absolute altimeter. The absolute altimeter, developed in 1942 and standardized on U.S. Army Air Force's anti-submarine aircraft by early 1943, used modified microwave radar to determine an aircraft's exact altitude to within 10 feet. This replaced the barometric altimeters that pilots had been using, which were accurate enough for normal flight, but far too imprecise for the kind of flying that was about to be attempted. With the absolute altimeter, a pilot could know his exact height above the water at any moment, even in darkness, even in clouds, even when the waves made visual judgment impossible. And that meant a pilot could fly at 50 feet, or 30, or 20, if he had the nerve for it. The tactical implications were revolutionary. An aircraft at 100 feet of altitude took precious seconds to dive to attack position. An aircraft already at 50 feet was in attack position. It appeared over the horizon with almost no warning at 50 feet. The radar horizon was only 9 miles and was on top of a surfaced submarine before the crew could react. More importantly, depth charges dropped from 50 feet had almost no time to sink horizontally away from their drop point. They fell nearly straight down. If you flew directly over the diving point of a submarine and released your charges from 50 feet, those charges would detonate right where the submarine was, at exactly the shallow depth where U-boats transited when crash diving. The shallow set depth charge was the second half of the equation. In 1942, depth charges were typically set to explode at 100 feet or deeper, on the assumption that submarines would have time to reach those depths before the charges arrived. But the first Sea Search Attack Group, established at Langley Field, Virginia, in June of 1942, developed effective depth charges with shallow fuse settings as shallow as 25 feet. Think about what this meant in practice. A U-boat on the surface, suddenly spotting an aircraft, would immediately initiate a crash dive. The crew would tumble down the conning tower hatch, someone would hit the alarm, the dive tanks would begin flooding. In 60 seconds, maybe less, the submarine would be submerged, but it would only be at periscope depth, maybe 30 or 40 feet down, still descending toward the safe depths where pressure would absorb the shock of explosions. And at that exact moment, depth charges set for 25 feet would detonate right next to the hull. The combination of low-altitude attack and shallow-set depth charges was devastating. Submarines that had survived hundreds of depth charge attacks from surface vessels, attacks where the charges exploded at 100 or 200 feet, where accumulated damage was the only real threat, were being cracked open by 4 or 5 charges exploding at precisely the depth where their hulls were most vulnerable. The Germans didn't understand what was happening at first. U-boat crews who survived these attacks, and there weren't many survivors, reported being hit almost instantly after spotting aircraft. No time to dive, no time to maneuver. Just the sudden appearance of a plane at wave-top level, the splash of depth charges, and then the crushing pressure of water entering the hull through ruptured seams. German intelligence officers tried to make sense of the reports. How were Allied aircraft appearing with so little warning? Were they using some new kind of radar? Some improved detection equipment? The truth was simpler and more terrifying. The aircraft were flying so low that they were below the effective radar horizon until they were right on top of you. The Bay of Biscay became a killing ground. This body of water, which U-boats had to cross to reach their bases in France from the Atlantic hunting grounds, had always been dangerous. Allied aircraft patrolled it constantly, knowing that every submarine entering or leaving the Atlantic had to pass through. But in the summer of 1943, it became what German submariners called the Valley of Death. The offensive began in earnest in April with Operation Derange. 75 long-range aircraft, mostly B-24 Liberators, equipped with the new centimetric radar and absolute altimeters, began flying coordinated patrols over known U-boat transit routes. They flew in all weather, day and night, maintaining a barrier that every submarine had to attempt to cross. The results were immediate and catastrophic for the Germans. In May, 5 U-boats were sunk in the bay. Another 7 were forced to abort their patrols due to damage. In June, 4 more were destroyed and 6 severely damaged. And then came July. July of 1943 was the month when the new tactics truly vindicated themselves. RAF Coastal Command's No. 19 Group, operating from bases in southwestern England, sank 11 U-boats in the Bay of Biscay during that single month. 11 submarines, 1/3 of all Allied submarine kills worldwide during July, destroyed in a single theatre of operations. The tactics were brutally simple. Aircraft would patrol at 50 feet, using radar to sweep for surfaced submarines. When a contact appeared, the pilot would immediately turn toward it and accelerate, closing the distance before the U-boat could dive. The submarine's lookouts, scanning the horizon for aircraft, often didn't spot the attacker until it was within a mile or two, at which point it was already too late. Flight Lieutenant Ramsden of RAF 220 Squadron demonstrated the technique on February 3rd. Flying a B-17 Fortress at 50 feet through a gap in the clouds, he spotted U-265 on the surface 4 miles from a convoy. Positioning his aircraft with the sun behind it, Ramsden dove from 50 feet, diving meant dropping to perhaps 30, and caught the U-boat crew completely unaware. 7 depth charges released from 50 feet. The submarine shattered instantly, going down with all 46 crew members. Total time from visual sighting to submarine destroyed, less than 2 minutes. 4 days later, another 220 Squadron Fortress caught U-624 on the surface, while the submarine was transmitting a lengthy radio report. The crew was so focused on communications that they never saw the aircraft until depth charges were already in the water. U-624 went down with all hands. The German response, when it came, revealed how thoroughly the Allies had gotten inside their enemy's head. Dönitz ordered U-boats to transit the Bay of Biscay in groups, travelling on the surface in formation so they could provide mutual anti-aircraft fire. The theory was sound. If submarines stayed on the surface and fought back instead of diving, their combined firepower might drive off attacking aircraft. It was a measure of desperation. U-boats were designed to hide beneath the waves, not to fight surface battles with aircraft. Their anti-aircraft guns, typically a single 20mm cannon, and perhaps 1 or 2 machine guns, were woefully inadequate against aircraft that could attack from any angle, that could afford to take some hits, that kept coming even when damaged. The first U-boat group formation was spotted by Flight Sergeant Anderson flying a Liberator on June 28th. 3 submarines travelling in a tight V formation, their guns manned and ready. Made his attack run anyway, coming in low and fast. The concentrated fire from 3 submarines tore into his aircraft, hitting it multiple times, but Anderson held his course and released his depth charges over the lead boat. The Liberator barely made it back to base, but one of the 3 submarines didn't make it home at all. The experiment with flak boats, heavily armed U-boats designed specifically to fight aircraft, failed even more spectacularly. U-441 was equipped with twin armoured turrets mounting quad 20mm cannons and a 37mm semi-automatic gun. On July 12th, it encountered 3 RAF Beaufighters in a ferocious surface duel. The problem was fundamental. A submarine is an unstable gun platform, rocking in the waves, while an aircraft is fast and maneuverable. U-441's crew managed to hit the attacking planes multiple times but couldn't prevent them from making their attacks. The submarine suffered 10 dead and 13 wounded before managing to escape. Dönitz wrote in his diary, "The submarine is not an ideal anti-aircraft weapon." The flak boat program was quietly abandoned. What the Germans were learning, at terrible cost, was that the tactical calculus of anti-submarine warfare had fundamentally shifted. For the first 3 years of the war, submarines had been hunters, predators that struck from concealment and disappeared before retribution could arrive. Now, suddenly, they were prey, hunted relentlessly by aircraft that could find them with radar and kill them before they could dive. The statistics tell the story. In the first half of 1942, not a single U-boat was sunk or damaged by transit area patrols in the Bay of Biscay. 0. In the 6 months from April through September of 1943, 26 U-boats were destroyed by aircraft in the bay alone. 26 submarines, each representing an investment of millions of Reichsmarks, each carrying a crew of 40 to 50 highly trained specialists, each capable of sinking tens of thousands of tons of Allied shipping removed from the war in a single body of water. And every single one of those kills followed the same pattern. Aircraft at wave-top height, depth charges set for shallow detonation, submarines caught in the worst possible position, submerged just deep enough to trap them, not deep enough to save them. The human cost was staggering. German U-boat crews had always faced terrible odds. About 3/4 of all U-boat men who served in World War II died in action. But the Bay of Biscay in the summer of 1943 became particularly nightmarish. Knowing that radar you would post lookouts, men who stood on the conning tower scanning the horizon for the telltale speck that meant death was incoming. And then, with no warning, an aircraft would appear not high in the sky where you expected it, but right on the wave tops, already in its attack run, already releasing depth charges. You'd hear the alarm, feel the deck lurch as the boat began emergency dive procedures, and then, if you were lucky, nothing. The charges would miss, or malfunction, or you'd get deep enough in time. If you weren't lucky, the pressure hull would rupture. Water would flood in with the force of an explosion. The boat would lose trim and sink like a stone, its crew trapped inside as it plummeted toward the bottom of the bay, 3,000 feet down into darkness and crushing pressure. Very few German submariners survived these attacks. When depth charges detonated within 15 feet of a diving submarine's hull, there were typically no survivors at all. The boat would simply disappear, leaving perhaps an oil slick, perhaps some debris, perhaps nothing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Korvettenkapitän Hans Ludwig Witt, commander of U-159, kept a diary during his submarine's final patrol in July of 1943. The entries, recovered years later from German naval archives, provide a window into what it was like to face these new tactics. July 15th. Sighted aircraft at dawn. Dove immediately. Depth charges very close. some damage to electrical systems. Continuing patrol, but crew is nervous. July 17th. Another aircraft attack. This one came from nowhere. Lookouts saw nothing until bombs were already falling. How are they finding us? How are they getting so close? July 24th. Witt's final entry. Aircraft everywhere. Cannot stay surfaced for more than minutes at a time. Battery nearly depleted. Must surface to charge. God help us. U-159 was sunk that afternoon by a US Navy PBY Catalina flying at 75 feet. The entire crew was lost. The psychological impact of these attacks went beyond the immediate casualties. German submarine crews had always understood that their service was dangerous, but danger you could understand and prepare for was one thing. This was something else. This was being hunted by an enemy you couldn't see coming, who could kill you before you had time to react, against whom your submarine's primary defense diving was essentially useless. The morale reports from U-Boat Command in the summer of 1943 make for grim reading. Crews were requesting transfers to surface ships. Men were developing what would later be recognized as combat fatigue or post-traumatic stress, physical symptoms of terror that appeared after repeated near misses. Some U-boats returned to base with crews that simply refused to go back out. Admiral Dönitz faced an impossible situation. His submarines were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced, but Hitler demanded that U-boat operations continue at all costs. The Führer's reasoning was coldly pragmatic. Even if U-boats sank fewer ships, they forced the Allies to maintain massive anti-submarine forces, destroyers, aircraft, escort carriers that might otherwise be bombing German cities or preparing for an invasion of Europe. So the submarines kept sailing, and the aircraft kept flying at 50 feet, and the oil slicks kept appearing on the surface of the Bay of Biscay. The turning point came in May of 1943, in a battle that had nothing to do with the Bay of Biscay but everything to do with these same tactics. Convoy ONS-5, consisting of 43 merchant ships escorted by 16 warships, was attacked by a wolf pack of 30 U-boats in the North Atlantic. It should have been a massacre of merchant shipping. Instead, it became a massacre of submarines. 6 U-boats were sunk by escorts or Allied aircraft. The merchantmen reached the protection of land-based air cover aircraft flying at low altitude with shallow-set depth charges, and Dönitz was forced to call off the attack. 2 weeks later, Convoy SC-130 destroyed at least 3 U-boats and damaged at least 1 more, for no merchant ship losses at all. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz made the most significant admission of the war. We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The numbers from May tell the story. 43 U-boats destroyed. 43. That represented 25% of the operational U-boat force wiped out in a single month. The Allies lost 58 ships in the same period, tragic for the merchant seamen involved, but strategically acceptable. The equation had reversed. Germany was losing submarines faster than new ones could be trained and deployed. The hunters had become the hunted. The low-altitude tactics were only part of this reversal, but they were a crucial part. The mid-Atlantic air gap, the area beyond the range of land-based aircraft where U-boats had operated with relative impunity, was closing as long-range B-24. Liberators were transferred from the Pacific. These aircraft, equipped with absolute altimeters and radar, could now patrol areas that had previously been safe hunting grounds for submarines, and everywhere they patrolled, they flew low. 50 feet became standard. Some pilots, the truly fearless or reckless ones, flew at 30 feet. A few accounts mention aircraft at 20 feet, close enough that the backwash from their propellers left visible tracks on the water. Squadron leader Bullock of the RAF demonstrated what this meant in practice when he caught U-boat U-134 on the surface in August. His attack, made from 40 feet, was so sudden that the German crew had no time to man their anti-aircraft guns. The submarine was destroyed so quickly that it left no survivors, just debris and an oil slick that marked where 48 men had died in the space of seconds. The American contribution to this campaign deserves particular attention. When the U.S. Army Air Forces began serious anti-submarine operations in early 1943, they brought with them not just aircraft and weapons, but a willingness to experiment with aggressive tactics. The 1st Sea Search Attack Group at Langley Field had developed and tested the low-altitude approach extensively, working out the optimal altitude, the best depth charge settings, the ideal attack profiles. American pilots took to low-altitude flying with enthusiasm that sometimes bordered on recklessness. 1 U.S. Navy report from the period notes dryly that crews have been cautioned against flying below 30 feet, except in cases of absolute necessity. The fact that such a caution was necessary tells you everything about how aggressively American pilots were prosecuting their attacks. Between February and August of 1943, U.S. aircraft operating in the Atlantic and Caribbean sank 13 U-boats. Every single kill involved low-altitude attack with shallow-set depth charges. The success rate was so dramatic that it forced a complete rethinking of anti-submarine doctrine. But success came at a cost. The Allies lost aircraft too. Flying at 50 feet left no margin for error. An engine failure, a moment of inattention, a sudden wind gust, any of these could send an aircraft into the water. Some pilots, pushing the limits of low-altitude flight, pushed too far. Others were shot down by U-boat anti-aircraft fire, their low altitude giving them no room to maneuver when hit. The statistics are sobering. During their time in England, U.S. Army Air Forces anti-submarine squadrons lost 12 planes and 102 men due to enemy action, accidents, or causes unknown. Navy patrol bomber losses over the bay amounted to 16 aircraft and 157 crewmen. But in return, those American sub-hunters received credit for sinking 13 U-boats, 13 submarines that would never sink another merchant ship, never threaten another convoy. When you consider that a single U-boat could sink tens of thousands of tons of shipping over its operational life, the exchange ratio becomes clearer. Losing one aircraft and 10 men to destroy a submarine and its 48-man crew, along with millions of Reichsmarks worth of equipment and the cargo capacity to threaten Atlantic convoys, that was an exchange the Allies could afford to make. The Germans couldn't match it. They were losing submarines, losing trained crews, losing the ability to interdict Allied shipping, and they had no effective counter. The flak boats had failed. Group tactics had failed. Staying submerged used up battery power and prevented submarines from reaching their patrol areas. The Bay of Biscay had become essentially impassable during daylight hours. By August of 1943, Dönitz was forced to order all U-boats to transit the bay submerged at night when possible, surfacing only when absolutely necessary to charge batteries, and even then, only for the minimum time required. This drastically reduced the operational efficiency of the submarine fleet. Boats that should have been hunting convoys in the Atlantic were instead crawling through the Bay of Biscay at slow speeds, underwater, trying not to be detected. The psychological warfare aspect of the campaign shouldn't be underestimated. German U-boat crews knew that Allied aircraft were out there, waiting. They knew that surfacing, even for a few minutes, might mean death. This created a constant state of tension that wore down crews before they even reached their operational areas. One German submariner, interviewed after the war, described the experience. "We called it the gauntlet. You had to run the gauntlet through Biscay before you could even begin your patrol. And you knew that many boats never made it through. You'd hear the radio silence from boats that should have reported their position. You'd see the gaps in the formation when you reached the rendezvous point, and you'd know aircraft got them. Flying so low, you couldn't see them coming, dropping charges set so shallow you couldn't dive deep enough to escape." The technological arms race continued throughout 1943 and into 44. Germans developed the Schnorchel, a breathing tube that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while remaining submerged at periscope depth. This helped, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem. Allied radar could detect even a Schnorchel mast, and aircraft would attack the moment they had a contact. The Germans also developed improved radar detectors, devices that could warn submarine crews when they were being illuminated by Allied radar. But by the time you received a radar warning from an aircraft at 50 feet, that aircraft was already in its attack run. The warning gave you perhaps 10 seconds, not enough time to dive deep enough to matter. By the end of 1943, the situation in the Bay of Biscay had stabilized into a pattern that favored the Allies overwhelmingly. Aircraft maintained constant patrols. Submarines attempted to transit as quickly as possible, often in small groups, always alert for attack. Most made it through, but enough didn't that the bay earned its reputation as the Valley of Death. The broader strategic implications were profound. With U-boats forced to spend more time hiding and less time hunting, Allied convoy losses dropped dramatically. From March through September of 1943, the period when these new tactics were being perfected and deployed, German submarines sank progressively fewer merchant ships each month, while their own losses climbed steadily. The crossover point came in May. That was the month when more U-boats were sunk than merchant ships. The month when the Battle of the Atlantic, which Winston Churchill later called "the only thing that really frightened me during the war," effectively ended as a strategic threat to Britain. The low-altitude tactics weren't the only factor in this victory. Improved radar, better depth charges using Torpex explosive instead of TNT, increased numbers of escort vessels, the breaking of German Enigma codes, long-range aircraft closing the mid-Atlantic gap, escort carriers providing air cover for convoys, all of these contributed. But the tactical innovation of flying at 50 feet and using shallow-set depth charges was the thread that connected many of these advantages. You could have the best radar in the world, but if you attacked from high altitude, the submarine had time to dive deep. You could have the most powerful depth charges ever developed, but if they detonated at 100 feet while the submarine was at 200 feet, they did nothing. The combination of low altitude and shallow settings turned all the other technological advantages into actual kills. By the time the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, the U-boat threat had been so thoroughly neutralized that Allied ships could cross the Atlantic with minimal escort. Submarines still operated, still occasionally sank ships, but they did so at such cost to themselves that Dönitz's force was effectively impotent. The final statistics are telling. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in German U-boats during World War II, approximately 30,000 died in action. That's a casualty rate of 75% higher than any other branch of the German military, higher than the Japanese kamikaze corps, higher than just about any military force in modern history. Those men died in steel tubes at the bottom of the ocean, crushed by water pressure or drowned in darkness, victims of depth charges that gave them no time to escape, no chance to fight back. Many of them died in the Bay of Biscay, killed by aircraft they never saw coming, flying at altitudes that seemed impossible, until suddenly those aircraft were right there, and it was too late. The Allied aircrew who flew these missions rarely talked about them after the war. Flying at 50 feet over the ocean for hours at a time, knowing that one mistake would send you into the water, knowing that submarine crews would shoot back if they had time, knowing that your equipment could fail, or the weather could turn, or any of 100 things could go wrong, it was exhausting, terrifying work. Flight Lieutenant Esmonde, who we met at the beginning of this story, flew 42 anti-submarine patrols over the Bay of Biscay between April and September of 1943. He was credited with 2 confirmed U-boat kills and participated in the attacks that damaged or sank 4 more. After the war, he returned to England, worked as a commercial pilot for British Airways, and raised 3 children. His son asked him once, in the 1970s, what it had been like to fly that low over the water. Esmonde thought for a long time before answering. Terrifying. Every single time. But we knew what we were doing was working. We could see it in the statistics: fewer merchant ships sunk, more U-boats destroyed. So we kept flying low, kept attacking, kept hunting them. Because that's what won the war. Not fancy tactics or brilliant strategy, just doing the job, day after day, at 50 feet over the Atlantic, until there weren't any submarines left to hunt. That's the essential truth of the low-altitude anti-submarine campaign. It wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't elegant. It was brutal, grinding, dangerous work that asked pilots to fly at altitudes that seemed suicidal, to make attacks that left no margin for error, to repeat the process day after day until the enemy simply couldn't continue. But it worked. The Germans mocked American aircraft in the early years of the war, called them crude, unimpressive compared to Luftwaffe designs. They thought American pilots were reckless cowboys with no understanding of proper tactics. They were wrong on both counts, but especially about the tactics. American pilots understood exactly what they were doing when they flew at 50 feet. They understood the risks. They understood that they were trading altitude, which meant safety, which meant time to react to problems, for effectiveness. They understood that depth charges dropped from 50 feet were exponentially more likely to kill submarines than depth charges dropped from 500 feet. And they were willing to make that trade, because the alternative was losing the Battle of the Atlantic. So they flew low, they sank submarines. And before breakfast on July 2nd, 1943, 3 U-boats went to the bottom of the Bay of Biscay, victims of a tactical innovation that seemed simple in retrospect but required enormous courage to implement. The legacy of these tactics extends beyond World War II. Modern anti-submarine warfare still uses low-altitude approaches, though now it's helicopters hovering at 100 feet rather than fixed-wing aircraft skimming the waves. The principle remains the same. Get close, attack fast, give the submarine no time to evade. The men who flew those missions, both American and British, both aircrew and the submarine crews they hunted, understood that they were fighting a different kind of battle. Not armies clashing on fields, not fleets exchanging broadsides, but aircraft and submarines playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek across millions of square miles of ocean. The aircraft won that game by changing the rules by flying so low that submarines couldn't see them coming, by attacking so fast that diving provided no escape. 3 U-boats sunk before breakfast wasn't unusual by the summer of 1943. It was just another morning in the Bay of Biscay, another day of aircraft at 50 feet and depth charges set for 25, another day of oil slicks marking where submarines used to be. The Germans had mocked the crude American tactics. They'd laughed at pilots who flew too low and too aggressively. They stopped laughing when those tactics started sinking submarines faster than Germany could replace them. By then, it was too late to adapt, too late to find a counter, Too late to do anything except keep sending submarines out and hope that maybe, somehow, some of them would make it through the gauntlet. Most didn't. The Bay of Biscay became a graveyard for U-boats, and the innovation that made it so was as simple as it was terrifying. Fly at 100 feet. No. Fly at 50. No. Lower still. Fly so low that spray hits your windscreen. Fly so low that the submarine lookouts can't spot you until you're already attacking. Fly low enough to win. And they did. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.